The drone screamed off its rail before I finished shouting the command, and every muscle in my body expected the field to erupt into chaos. It did not. My name is Thren Kaslove, and I have trained cadets from 6 different worlds. I know the sound a body makes when it decides to run. I know the sharp intake of breath, the drop of the shoulder, the scatter of boots against packed dirt. I have heard that sound 1,000 times, from 1,000 different throats, in 1,000 different accents of fear. That morning, on the open training field, with a live pulse drone locked onto a human cadet named Daniel Fenwick, I heard nothing at all. He stood still. His eyes tracked the drone the way a hunter tracks a wounded animal, slow and patient, waiting to see what it would do next. The drone banked toward him, closed the gap, and then, for reasons that took me 3 days to even begin to understand, it slowed. I gripped the control baton so hard my claws left marks in the casing. The drone is not a simple machine. It is grown from predator stock, stripped of higher thought, but never stripped of instinct. And that instinct reads a target the way I read one. Gait, posture, the tiny signals a body gives, right before it commits to fight or flight. Daniel gave it nothing to read. The drone circled him twice, its targeting spindle twitching with something that looked almost like confusion, and then I keyed the abort sequence before it could decide what to do with a target that refused to behave like prey. The silence on the field afterward was worse than any noise could have been. 9 other cadets stood in their positions, watching, and not one of them looked surprised. A young woman near the back, her name tag reading Alice Doran, glanced at Daniel and gave the smallest nod, as if he had simply done what anyone would do. As if standing motionless in front of a hunting weapon was the obvious choice, rather than the strangest thing I had witnessed in 11 cycles of running this drill. I called Daniel to the platform alone. My hands were still not steady. "You did not run," I said. "Running doesn't help against something faster than you that tracks by movement," he said, calm, almost bored. "If I break the lock by holding still and letting it commit to a bad angle, that works better than sprinting in a straight line. It's in your own training manual, Section 9. I just did what the manual says." It was a good answer. It explained the tactics. It did not explain why his heartbeat, which I had checked on the medical scanner the moment he stepped off the field, had barely risen above resting. Before I sent anything up the chain, I spoke with 2 more cadets, because a single answer from a single human was not enough to build a report on. I found a cadet named Oliver Marsh, cleaning his gear near the equipment shed, and asked him plainly why he thought his squadmate had not run. "Fear makes most animals move," Oliver said, not looking up from his work. "But it doesn't always make them move away. Sometimes it makes them go quiet and count. I think that's what Daniel was doing, counting the drone's turns, figuring its pattern, waiting for the gap. Running would have wasted the time he needed to actually solve the problem." A second cadet, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen Marsh, no relation to Oliver, as she quickly told me, gave a different answer entirely when I asked her the same question later that afternoon. "Honestly, sir, some of us were scared," she admitted. "I could feel my hands shaking, but back home, showing that on your face in front of a threat has never done anyone any good. You learn to keep your hands still, even when your heart isn't. It's not about not feeling it. It's about not letting the thing hunting you see it." That distinction sat with me longer than I expected. Our predator lineage reads bodies as honest instruments, unable to lie about the fear inside them, and it had never occurred to me that another species might spend generations learning to make their bodies lie on purpose, not out of deception, but out of survival. I sent my report up the chain that evening, describing what I had seen in careful, measured language, because I did not yet have the words for what I actually believed. I said the human cadets showed unusual composure under simulated threat. I did not say that my own weapon had hesitated to strike them, because I was not sure anyone would believe it, and because I was not entirely sure I believed it myself. The response came back faster than I expected, and it did not come from my usual commanding officer. It came from a senior tactician named Colonel Varric Ossas, a broad, heavy-set predator from the same hunting lineage as our combat drones, a male with a reputation for treating every report of unusual human behavior as exaggeration by soft-hearted instructors. He arrived at the academy 2 days later, uninvited, and told me he intended to run the drill himself. "Your report says the drone hesitated," he said, standing on my training platform as if he owned it. "Drones do not hesitate. Drones execute. If your cadets are not responding correctly to the threat, then the correct conclusion is that your cadets are defective, not that the machine developed doubts." I told him that was not what I had written. He told me my opinion was noted and then ignored. He ordered the charge increased. "Not to a lethal level," he said, "but close enough to it that a mistake would leave permanent damage rather than a bruise and a lesson." I argued against it. I told him the cadets were not soldiers yet, that the drill existed to teach reflexes, not to punish them for reflexes they did not have. He told me that if the humans were as calm as I claimed, a higher charge would not matter to them at all, and if they were not as calm as I claimed, then my report was wrong and needed correcting in front of witnesses. I could not stop him. He outranked me by 2 full grades, and the Academy Charter gives training officers very little authority once a senior tactician takes direct control of a drill. That night, before the second drill, the colonel found me in the equipment bay checking the drone's charge coils by hand, something I had not done myself in years. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You really believe the machine hesitated?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I believe I have run this drill for 11 cycles, I answered, "and I have never once seen a targeting spindle recalculate against a stationary, undefended target. I do not know what that means yet. I only know what I saw." He was quiet for a while, turning a spare charge cell over in his hands. "My lineage built these drones from our own hunting minds," he said eventually. "If the instinct core doubts a target, it doubts it for a reason older than either of us. I have spent my whole career trusting that instinct completely. I am not eager to discover it might be more honest than I am." He left without saying anything else, and I did not sleep well that night, turning his words over the same way he had turned that charge cell. So the next morning I stood at the edge of the field instead of the platform, and I watched. This time the colonel chose 2 cadets instead of 1, to make the test harder to dismiss as a fluke. Daniel Fenwick again, and a second cadet named Grace Whitlow, a quiet woman who rarely spoke during lessons, but who I had noticed always finished her drills with the least wasted movement of anyone in her squad. The drone launched. The charge indicator on its casing glowed a shade of amber I had never seen active during a training exercise, a color that meant real harm rather than a stinging lesson. My stomach turned over. I opened my mouth to call for an abort, colonel's orders or not, but before I could speak, something happened that neither the colonel nor I expected. Daniel and Grace did not simply stand still this time. They moved, but not away from the drone. They moved toward each other, closing the distance between them, until they stood back to back, eyes scanning opposite halves of the field, tracking the drone's angle of approach between them, without ever losing sight of it. The drone hesitated harder than it had with a single target. Its spindle spun through 3 full recalculations, hunting logic straining against a shape it had never been trained to recognize. 2 potential targets who had, in the space of half a second, turned themselves into something that looked less like prey and more like a single creature deciding where to strike from. It broke off its approach entirely and circled wide, searching for an angle that did not exist, because Daniel and Grace kept turning together, matching its arc, closing whatever gap it tried to open. The colonel's hand hovered over the manual override, the one that could force the drone to strike regardless of its own hesitation, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as pure animal fear, the same fear I imagine every prey species feels when a bigger creature raises a claw. "Colonel," I said, and my voice did not sound like my own, "if you force that strike at this charge level, you will injure 2 cadets to prove a point that your own drone has already answered." He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he would do it anyway, simply to prove that rank outweighed doubt. Then his eyes moved back to the field, to 2 humans standing perfectly calm in front of a weapon that had, by every measure our species understood, given up on hunting them. He lowered his hand. "Abort," he said, quiet enough that I almost missed it. The drone powered down mid-arc and dropped to the grass, and for a long moment, nobody on that field moved at all, Daniel and Grace finally broke apart, and Grace let out a breath that was the first sign of real tension I had seen from either of them since the drill began. A small, human sound that told me the calm had cost her something, even if it never showed on her face. The colonel did not speak to me again that day. He collected the drone's data core himself and left the academy without a word, and I assumed I would hear nothing further, that the matter would quietly disappear, the way uncomfortable reports often do when they involve senior officers being proven wrong. Instead, 3 weeks later, I was summoned to a review board I had never requested, made up of officers from 4 different departments, all of whom wanted to hear, in my own words, exactly what I had seen on that field. I told them everything. The first drill, the hesitation, Daniel's calm explanation that sounded like tactics but felt like something else entirely. The second drill, the charge increase, the way 2 cadets had turned a hunting drone's own logic against it, simply by refusing to separate. Another officer on the board, a younger male named Commander Patrick Solane, pressed me harder than the rest. He wanted to know whether the human cadets had simply been trained to fake composure for our benefit, whether the entire display had been a kind of performance meant to unsettle us rather than a genuine absence of panic. I told him I had considered the same thing, and that it was why I had checked Daniel's medical scanner myself, instead of trusting his expression alone. His pulse had climbed, slower than expected, but not absent. His breathing had shortened slightly under the drone's second pass. The fear had been there, buried under something disciplined enough to keep it from reaching the surface. That discipline, I told the commander, was in some ways more unsettling than open panic would have been, because panic is a reaction we understand. Controlled calm in the face of a hunting weapon is not. Commander Solane sat back at that, and for the first time since the review began, he did not have an immediate follow-up question. One of the officers, a sharp, older woman named Director Ilian Vask, asked me the question that had been sitting under my ribs for weeks without a proper shape. "Do you believe they were not afraid?" she asked. "Or do you believe they simply do not show fear the way our instruments are built to measure it?" I told her I did not know, and that I had stopped trying to guess. I told her instead what Daniel had said to me on the first day, about how his people had once faced things that hunted them long before they ever left their own world, and how standing still had never meant an absence of a plan. It had meant the opposite. It had meant a decision already made, held quietly behind a calm face until the moment it was needed. The board sat with that for a long while before Director Vask spoke again. "Then perhaps," she said, "the drones are not malfunctioning at all. Perhaps they are the only instruments precise enough to notice something the rest of us have been too slow to see." In the weeks that followed, the evasion drill for human cadets was rewritten from the ground up, not because the humans had failed it, but because every officer who reviewed the footage came to the same uneasy conclusion I had reached on that very first morning. The drill had been built to test fear. It had never been built to test the alternative, and none of us, for all our generations of hunting instinct, had a name for what the alternative actually was. The changes did not stay confined to my academy for long. Within a season, 3 other training centers across the sector requested copies of my report, and a 4th asked whether their own drone cores might need recalibrating for human cadets entirely, since 2 more instructors had already logged strange hesitations of their own without knowing my findings existed. It seemed the question I had stumbled into on a quiet training field was not mine alone to answer. Every officer who worked with humans long enough eventually found themselves asking some version of the same thing, usually in private, usually a little embarrassed to say it out loud. Colonel Oss requested a formal correction be added to his original order, admitting that the escalation had been unnecessary and that the drone's behavior during the second drill matched my initial report exactly. It was not an apology, not in the way our species usually offers one, but among predator lineages, admitting that an instinct core had been right and a senior officer had been wrong is close enough to count. I still run the field most mornings. I still watch new cadets from a dozen different worlds break and scatter when the drone locks onto them, the same way cadets always have, the way I expect them to. And every so often, when a human cadet stands their ground instead, I feel that same old flicker of animal doubt rise up in my chest. The question my own drone asked on that first morning and never quite answered. Is this prey? I no longer expect the answer to be yes, and some quiet part of me, the part that has spent its whole life reading fear in other bodies, has started to wonder if that question was always the wrong one to ask about humans in the first place. Daniel graduated near the top of his class, and when I signed his final evaluation, I found myself writing something I had never written for any cadet before him. Not that he showed exceptional composure under pressure, though he did. Not that he understood tactics beyond his training level, though he did that too. I wrote that he had, without meaning to, taught an instructor who believed he already understood fear, that there was more than one way for a living thing to face down something bigger than itself, and that some of those ways leave no trace at all until the moment they are needed. Grace requested a transfer to advanced reconnaissance training soon after, and when I asked her why, she told me something I still think about. The drone wasn't trying to hurt us, she said. It was trying to understand us. I figured the least I could do was make that a little easier for the next one. Not every officer welcomed the change. A few of the older instructors argued that softening the drill for human cadets was a mistake, that we were simply excusing a species for failing to react the way every other recruit had reacted for generations. I understood the concern, because I had felt a version of it myself on that very first morning, standing at the platform with my claws locked around the control baton. But the drone's own hesitation was not a soft reading. It was the single most honest response our technology had ever given us, built from instinct, older than any argument an instructor could make in a meeting room, and it had looked at a still, calm human and found nothing it recognized as something to chase. I began keeping a private log after that, separate from my official reports, noting small moments from other drills that I might once have dismissed. A cadet named Nathan Price, who hummed quietly under his breath during a stress simulation, as if the sound itself was a kind of anchor. A cadet named Lily Ashford, who counted backward from 10 under pressure, her lips barely moving, a habit she said her grandmother had taught her long before she ever left her homeworld. None of it looked like fear the way our instruments were built to measure it, and all of it, I was beginning to understand, was fear all the same, simply given a shape none of us had been trained to read. I do not know what our people will make of humanity in the long run. I do not know if the calm I witnessed on that field was courage, or training, or something older than both, carried quietly from a homeworld none of us have ever visited. What I do know is that I have spent 11 cycles believing I understood the shape of fear in every species under our command, and in a single morning, 2 human cadets and 1 very confused drone taught me that I had only ever been looking at half the picture. The academy still runs the drill every week, the drones still hunt, and most cadets still scatter, because scattering is often the right choice, and fear, when it moves a body quickly enough, has always kept more soldiers alive than false courage ever has. But I watch the human cadets a little differently now. I watch for the stillness rather than the scatter, because I have learned, the hard way, that stillness in their kind is rarely the absence of a decision. Sometimes, on quiet evenings after the field has emptied and the drones have been powered down for the night, I think back to that first amber warning light on the colonel's console, and to the 2 cadets who turned toward each other instead of running, and I understand a little better why so many species before mine have found humanity difficult to predict. We built our weapons and our training from generations of hunting instinct, certain that fear would always announce itself the same way, in the same language, no matter which world a recruit was born on. Humanity taught us, quietly and without meaning to, that the language of fear is not universal at all, and that the ones who learn to hide it best are not always the ones who feel it least. I no longer walk onto that field expecting to fully understand what I am looking at. I walk onto it expecting to be surprised, and after everything I have seen, I have come to think that is the more honest way to run this drill after all. It is usually the decision itself, waiting,